Hello everyone, my name is Garvin and I read things and blather about them on the internet for your entertainment. So we have finally arrived on the shores of Europe, which means our long voyage through merfolk mythology nears its endpoint. I am, however, breaking Europe down into several videos. Part of this is a matter of sources. Whereas for regions like sub-Saharan Africa, it was a real hunt to find verifiable sources. The vast majority of European folklore was not only translated to English centuries ago, but it's very easy to verify and trace back. Of course, the second reason really ties into that. I'm an American. I only really read English, which limits me. And I do apologize, but it is what it is. Now, I am going to mention real quick that this topic was chosen by my ever-wise patrons, one of whom would like me to remind you that mermaids should be considered sea mammals, and whose ranks you can join for as little as $1 a month by clicking on the link in the description below. If you'd rather leave a one-time donation, there's a link to my Ko-fi site, and if you do leave a one-time donation, feel free to leave a request for a future topic or video. Today we're going to be looking at merfolk myths from Greenland, Iceland, and the British Isles. Now, I know that Greenland is geologically part of North America, but given that all these myths are from European colonists, I feel more comfortable lumping them in with other European myths. Also, my sources show Greenland stories as sharing the same word for merman or mermaid with Iceland, and that's the word, and I apologize if I mispronounce this, marbendil. Although they do seem to describe very different creatures. Now in Greenland, they're very large creatures, and the story is that they have the head, neck, and shoulders of a human being, although it does appear that they're wearing some sort of peaked helmet, and they will rise straight up from the water and then fall over. And if they fall towards your ship, then some of your crew is doomed to die on the voyage. But if it falls away from the ship, everyone will be spared, even if you run into rough waters. Another portent they had is that if a mermaid appears, catches fish, and throws it into the boat, then disaster will befall you. But if the mermaid eats the fish or throws it back into the sea, good news! You get to live. Either way, in Greenland, it was commonly believed if you saw a merfolk, a storm was soon to follow, so you should batten those hatches. Meanwhile, in Iceland, the marbendil was smaller than humans and believed to have abilities like seeing into the future or mystically knowing the truth. And they would use those abilities to barter for their freedom from fishermen who caught them by accident. Now, why the fishermen would want to keep them against their will, I don't know, but bargaining apparently had to be done. Sometimes the merfolk would ransom themselves by promising cattle, and when the sea cows arrived, they would be cows, not manatees, but they would have a bladder over their faces, and to keep them on land, you had to catch the cow and burst the bladder on their face. That said, everyone agreed that merfolk had magnificent cows, and if you could get a merfolk cow, you were set. A more famous story from Iceland is Then the Mermaid Laughed. Or excuse me, the Merman Laughed. Now, the story is a fisherman catches a merman who complains he was fixing the scoop on his mother's chimney when he was rudely netted. Now, for those of you wondering why a merfolk needs a chimney, we'll come back to this. Well, the fisherman, for some reason, brings the merman home, and when he pulls into port, his dog is there, comes running, and promptly loses its mind. We've all experienced this. Your dog is just that happy you're home. But the fisherman gets frustrated and hits his dog, and then the merman laughs. Well, dog, man, and merman head to the gentleman's farm, and the fisherman trips over a low mound of dirt and curses at it, and then the merman laughs. When they come to the fisherman's home, the fisherman's wife comes out and enthusiastically hugs and kisses the fisherman, who responds just as enthusiastically, and then the merman laughs. So the fisherman gets annoyed by this and asks the merman, "What the hell is so funny?" And the merman replies, "Take me back out to sea and I'll tell you, and you'll profit by it." The fisherman, likely tired of these games, agrees, and in a couple days they head back out, and the merman explains, "I laughed because you struck your dog, who loves you very much and would die for you, while embracing your faithless wife, who prays for your death. I also laughed because the mound you cursed so thoroughly holds enough wealth to hold you in comfort until the end of your days," and promptly jumped off the boat back into the sea. While the story doesn't tell us what became of the dog or the wife, it does tell us that the fisherman who released the merman came back, dug up the mound, and found a fortune in gold. In some versions, the merman tells the guy to enjoy the gold because he'll be dead in 3 days, and die he does. So, kind of choose your own adventure there, I guess. Now, over in the Shetland Isles, merfolk were often described as having the lower bodies of seals instead of fish, and on top of that, it is said their seal parts were actually a sort of covering that they put on to travel the seas, and that they could take it off and they were human underneath. They were also considered natural sorcerers with bewitching voices and the abilities to summon storms and tell the future. That said, if you found their seal covering, you could force whoever the owner of that seal covering was to marry you. But be aware, if they retrieve it, they're gone. There are a lot of versions of this story that are told across the British Isles, and the lady, and it's almost always a lady, by the way, which is a little creepy, is always remarked upon as being a good wife and a fantastic mother, and they have a lot of kids, but the story always ends with the lady finding her seal parts and running back to the sea, where she is greeted by a whole squad of seals, including one very large male seal. And her human husband, who has run out into the beach at this point, sees her. She turns around and yells something along the lines of, "Goodbye and farewell, I liked you well enough, but I always liked my first husband better." I would honestly assume her liking her first husband better is kind of a given, as he probably didn't kidnap her into the marriage. This is very much like Selkie myths from the same region, and I'll get into that in a future video. Now, part of the myth is the belief that under the sea there's a whole nother world of dry land, where air-breathing people, not that different from you and me, lived and worked, and their lives weren't that much different from ours above the sea. We see elements of that in Icelandic myths that I discussed earlier, with merfolks having chimneys and cattle, and it's going to come up in Scottish and Irish stories as well. In fact, it's also a centerpiece of a story from the Isle of Man, where in order to harvest treasure from shipwrecks, a man is lowered into the sea in a primitive diving bell, and he tells a story of finding an entire open-air city under the sea, where there are jewels just inset everywhere, and gold covering everything. So, not only are merfolk magically powerful in these stories, they're also fabulously wealthy. The downside is they also trap the souls of people who drown into magical cages, but we'll talk about that in a story where that goes into more detail later. Moving over to Scotland, they often had their mermaids living in their lochs, rivers, and streams as often as the sea, and they were called various names as well, such as Maiden Hara or Maiden Natena, but often they were called seas. They were described as having the upper body of a woman with the lower body of a young salmon. Some of these mermaids hunted young men to drown and eat them. Others sought young men to kidnap them and marry them. So this obsession with cross-species romance, as we'll call it for the sake of the dread Lord algorithm, terror beyond his name, isn't one-sided. I couldn't find the specific story, but some of my sources mentioned that there was an old Scottish story of mermaids having wings and losing them, but this is only mentioned once or twice, so I'm taking it with some salt. I just thought I'd pass that on. Anyways, the mermaids of the Loch are also very knowledgeable about medicine and can grant wishes if you beat them in a wrestling match, which is just the kind of rumor I would spread if I was hungry and wanted my food to come to me. So I'm a little skeptical of this. Of course, there are romantic mermaids, but that comes with its own dangers, and this story kind of displays this, where it tells of a mermaid who lived in a stream and tried to romance a local shepherd boy by bringing him all sorts of riches from the sea, and gradually she convinces him to come closer, and they embrace, but she gets excited and jumps the gun and tries to drag him into the water, causing him to panic. So he fights his way free and runs for it. Enraged, she throws a pebble, hitting him in the back, which is causing him to fall over into agony, and after 3 days die. Which is a bit of an overreaction if you ask me. Like in the Shetland Isles stories I mentioned earlier, the Scottish also believed that mermaids needed an aid to travel the sea. In this case, they believed it was a belt and a pouch that held their mirror and comb, because these stories often said that mermaids like to come up to the shore, sit on a rock, look at themselves in a mirror while they styled their hair. What's interesting is that every story about someone taking that pouch ends with the mermaid finding her pouch and returning to the sea. Although many of these stories have the mermaid keeping an eye on her children and their children and so on down the generations, even protecting them from storms at sea or appearing to guide them to good fishing areas. In some cases, it's said that the descendants of mermaids could be marked by having small webs between their fingers and other identifying features. I'm going to ask you guys to remember that, because we are coming back to that idea in a later video. Heading down to England, we find their mermaid traditions are much the same as the ones we've already covered, but they do have some interesting, unique stories. For example, there's a story of an older fisherman who comes across a mermaid who is left stranded on the beach by the retreating tide. She pleads with him to help her return to the sea because she left her napping husband and playing children, and she is very afraid that if she doesn't get back soon to make dinner, he's going to wake up and in his hunger eat some of their kids. You know, this might explain the desire for a human husband, now that I think about it, because say what you will, your human husband probably won't eat any of the kids just because dinner's a little late. Well, they cut a deal for him to carry her over to the sea in exchange for 3 wishes. And he promptly does his part, and she goes, "Wow, thanks for holding up your end of the deal. What wishes would you like?" And without blinking, he asked for the power to break curses, compel spirits to do good work, find stolen property for people, and pass these powers on to his sons. Which I think is technically 4 wishes, but these are just so wholesome wishes that I'm like, I guess we can give him one. And she feels the same way. In fact, she is so charmed by this guy that she decides, screw it, I'm gonna take him home with me. But he's not ready to go, and he fights her off with an iron pocket knife. And she tells him, hey, you know what? My bad. No worries. You still get your wishes, but I'm coming back for you in 9 years. Well, he goes on to do good works for his wished-for powers and passes them on to his sons and teaches them to use them for the benefit of their community. But sure enough, in 9 years, after he's forgotten about this threat, she comes for him while he is fishing, charms him, and carries him off. And in some versions, she shows back every 9 years to carry away another male family member. So I guess she decided she wanted the whole darn set. Another story is the Mermaid of Zennor, who is a fine lady able to transform herself from human to mermaid and back, and did so in order to attend church every Sunday. I guess she liked the sermon. She did this until she caught the eye of the best male singer in the choir, and she lured him off, not being able to resist the temptation. And while he's never seen again, she would appear years later in her mermaid guise to chase off a fishing boat, claiming they had come too close to where her children was playing. So, I guess the guy lived long enough to father several children, or maybe he just decided living under the sea was the better deal. Given what we've heard of under the sea, I don't blame him. Ireland has a number of interesting mermaid stories as well, and many of these mermaids are also part salmon. For example, the story of Liban. She was a princess of a kingdom that was founded by exiles. Now that's a tale in its own right, so let me know if you'd like me to go into it in a separate video. That kingdom was drowned by a magical wellspring. Liban, however, survived in an underwater chamber with only her lapdog for company until she was turned into a mermaid and her dog into an otter by forces unknown. She would live in the waterways of Ireland, traveling between them and out into the sea via underground passages that connected all these lakes, rivers, and the ocean. By the way, there's that idea of all water is connected by underground passages again. And she lived this way for about 300 years. At this point, she met a trio of Christian saints who convinced her to convert, and on their direction, she was brought to a church where the priest prayed with her and then told her she could make a choice since she had lived so much longer than a mortal was supposed to already. She could convert and pass away immediately, going straight to heaven, or she could convert and live on earth for another 300 years, and if she hadn't fallen back into sin, she would pass away and go into heaven. Liban, having lived most of her life alone at this point, and having even lost her little lapdog, decided to convert and head to her heavenly reward immediately. So the priest converted her, and she died. Moving on from that theologically fraught story, let's look at another Irish mermaid that I expect at least some of my listeners would already be aware of, the Merrow. The women of the Merrow race are described as being very beautiful with green hair and the lower parts of a fish, while the men are said to be very large, powerful, ugly, and exceedingly fond of brandy. The Merrow, like other mermaids we discussed here, needed an item to travel the sea, in this case a hat. If you grab the hat, you could, and go ahead and say it with me now, compel the mermaid to marry you. However, in just like every other version of this story, eventually she will find the damn hat and head back home. Also of note is that people with Merrow ancestry may have webbed hands, or greenish skin, or even scales. I'm going to ask you to remember that in a future video. We're coming back to this. There were also two stories that had nothing to do with marrying mermaids, which I'm kind of sick of at this point, so I'm going to talk about these two stories. The first of these two stories is from the County Mayo in Ireland. A poor fisherman runs into a mermaid while out at sea, and she offers him a deal. She is willing to make a rich man out of him if he promises her his eldest son in 21 years. The fisherman protests, saying he has no son, but the mermaid replies she knows damn well that the fisherman's wife is pregnant and will give birth to a healthy son in 7 days. He says he needs to think on it, and she says, no worries, come back tomorrow night then. Well, our fisherman runs home, tells his wife, who turns around and says, it's a good deal, let's take it. Geez, glad she's not my mom. No Mother's Day gifts for you, lady. Well, he does what his wife tells him to, and the mermaid leads him to an island covered in gold and tells him to take all he can carry, which he does. and he heads back home, and he uses the gold to buy land, livestock, and other bits of property which will generate more wealth for him, which makes him another fairy tale creature, the lottery winner who invests wisely. Well, in addition to becoming fabulously wealthy, the ex-fisherman and his wife managed to have 6 more sons for 7 total, so I'm going to say this couple really did come out ahead in the deal. However, the guilt just kind of eats at him, and before his son's 21st birthday, he sits down and just confesses everything to his son, who I will call Tobin because the story didn't bother to name him, so I'm going to. Well, Tobin decides right then and there he is not waiting around for some weird mermaid to come get him, and really, can you blame him? So he thanks his father for telling him the truth, declares he's leaving town, and his parents, perhaps out of guilt, not only don't stop him, but give him food and money for the trip. Tobin perhaps wisely decides not to go by sea and proceeds inland. Perhaps that's not so wise, because in his flight, he crosses some woods and runs face first into the only damn lion in all of Ireland. I mean, there's no record of lions existing at any point in historical times in the wilds of Ireland. And here, one just comes randomly strolling right up. Well, Tobin thinks this is the end, but the lion instead looks at him and says, "Hey man, you look tired. Come right on my back." So I guess this is frickin' Iceland on vacation then. I don't know, man. I just tell you what I find in these stories. But Tobin figures that there's no need for the lion to be clever or try to trick him when the lion already has him dead to rights. So he just hops on the lion's back. And the lion goes, "Hey, I'm going to take you to a house by a lake that I know the folks will put you up for the night. You might want to ask them about weapons, because you're rather defenseless, my man." And Tobin goes, "You know, I hadn't thought of that, but having been confronted by the only damn lion in Ireland, I'm not letting this go. You have a point." Well, the lion takes him to the house just like he said he would. Tobin goes in, is welcomed by the family who lives there, and they tell him they're happy to put him up for the night and give him a home-cooked meal, but warn him tomorrow is likely to be the saddest day of the year, as the king's daughter is being taken out to the sea and tied up to be eaten by a ravenous sea monster. The king and his knights are prepping to fight said sea monster, but there is little hope of victory. Now, I don't know why this is happening, because the story doesn't say, but I'm assuming somebody got offended by something, and hence princess being eaten by sea monster. This does seem to pop up a bit in mythology, doesn't it? Tobin goes, "Wow, that's crazy. You know, this place seems dangerous. You guys don't have like a weapon or something I could buy off of you?" And the family says, "Well, we don't have anything we could sell you, but we have this old rusty sword that we use to cut things." And Tobin's like, "That'll do it. I'll take the old rusty sword." Come the dawn of the next day, the unnamed family, Tobin and the rusty sword, head out to see the princess being tied to a golden chair, with the king, the princes, and the knights of the realm arrayed for battle around her, when the sea monster comes up and just demolishes them all so quickly that it's honestly kind of insulting. You feel bad reading this. Well, Tobin's had a rough couple of days, and he just kind of snaps. Perhaps the sea monster and the mermaid he was running from got hooked together in his mind. Perhaps it was just the pressure, or perhaps he just didn't want to see anyone eaten. Either way, he pulls out his rusty sword, rushes out, and just shreds that sea monster to pieces. Well, after that performance, the princess announces there isn't anyone on Earth she's marrying other than Tobin, which is somewhat understandable, all things considered, and they are married quite quickly. The night after his wedding, Tobin is standing on the shore, looking up at the stars, trying to make sense of his life, when he realizes, oh, he just turned 21. And who should appear but the mermaid who started all of this? Well, Tobin, as we can see, is somewhat of a fighty lad, puts up his hands and tells her he's not going quietly, only she says she's got no interest in taking him. That it was her who led him here to become the son-in-law of the king and kill the sea monster in the first place. And seeing that he is well and will be properly taken care of, she will go her way and they will never meet again, but she wishes him all happiness. Which implies all sorts of weirdness here, but that's all of the story I could find. So we're going to leave Tobin standing on that seesaw, probably even more confused than we are by all of this. I think that's a pretty uplifting note to end our last story on, but I do want to cover one more bit of Merrow lore, because, you see, they're also a somewhat popular sea creature in Dungeons and Dragons. If you need to know what Dungeons and Dragons is, it's a fantasy game, and I'm not going to go too deep down this rabbit hole, because then we will be here all night. Just go ahead and ask in the comments if you're not sure what Dungeons and Dragons is, and if I don't give you an explanation and a link, somebody will. Now, unlike other games, D&D often updates and changes its rules, and these new rule sets are called editions. Right now, Dungeons and Dragons is on its 5th edition, although next year in 2025, they may be releasing a new rule set that they're calling D&D 1 instead of 6th edition. I'm not going to get into that because, again, it's a deep rabbit hole. We'll be here all night. Now, the Merrow started out in the very first rule set, or the 1st edition, only they started out as aquatic ogres, as in, that was their subtitle, Merrow, parentheses, aquatic ogre, which I want to think may have been influenced how Merrow mills were described as ugly and beast-like. And as you can see by the picture I'm using on the screen right now, Merrow in the early editions of D&D were shown as having legs and not any real kind of hybrid form. Now in the current 5th edition, the Merrow are described as mermaids who were corrupted by a demon lord and drawn into the waters of the abyss, which is the home dimension of demons in Dungeons and Dragons. Again, I'm keeping this as simplified and brief as possible because D&D is its own rather complex and rich mythology at this point. It is not a rabbit hole we want to dive into just right now. Anyways, the Merrow in the game still serve this demon lord, and this way you can have pretty friendly mermaids for your players to talk to and do other things with, and evil, scary mermaids for your players to fight and kill guilt-free. So it's kind of an interesting compromise there between wanting to have creatures to talk to and creatures to fight. I thought that was kind of an interesting piece of modern legend there, so I thought I'd share it with y'all. On that note, thank you for listening, and I hope you found this video informative, or at least entertaining. If you did, please leave a like, a comment, or even subscribe, as all of these help me in my eternal struggle against the Dread Lord Algorithm. Terror be on his name. I'd also like to give a special thanks to Big Steve, my biggest supporter. I could not pull this off without your support. Like I said, there's a lot of research due to just the sheer amount of text available for Europe. So for next week, I'll actually be posting a story read by another one of my kind patrons about a Guam mermaid tale, with my patrons getting special bonus content. After that, we will tackle the mermaid myths of Northern Europe, and on a third video, we will hopefully wrap up Europe completely, and I hope you'll join me. But until then, look after yourselves, look after each other, and of course, keep reading.